Bienvenidos. This is a podcast that explores Latinx media and culture in its many forms. I am Dr. Rojo Robles.
And I am Dr. Rebecca L. Salois. And we are Latinx and Latin American Studies professors at Baruch College in New York City. In this podcast, we will analyze Latinx film, television, literature, art, and cultures.
We will consider how these works are perceived, analyze them, and investigate the real-world reflections and implication of that work on Latinx cultures in the U.S. and beyond.
Welcome to Latinx Visions. Bienvenidas, bienvenidos, bienvenides. Welcome back, everyone. As mentioned in the previous student episode from July, today we're going to be sharing a bonus episode from New York Comic Con in 2023. The panel took place on Thursday, October 12th, and was titled Comics in College, Pop Culture Pedagogy, and Fandom Final Projects. Participants included Professors Asif Saddiqi, Jennifer Caroccio Maldonado, Michelle Crowley, and myself, Rebecca Salois. In today's world, it's important to expand the idea of what college-level pedagogy can look like. In this panel, we discuss some of the many ways that we, as professors, have approached teaching humanities and social science courses using comics, pop culture, and fandom. We share pedagogical approaches and assignment ideas that allow students to demonstrate their knowledge of a given subject while appealing to their, and our own, nerdy interests. What follows is our panel discussion from that day in October, along with a brief Q&A from the audience. I have re-recorded the questions asked by the audience due to lack of audience microphone and poor audio quality of the original questions. There will be a link in the show notes to this episode so you can check out the slides that we presented that day and connect with any of the panelists. Thank you to all the panelists, and a special thanks to New York Comic Con and the New York Public Library for seeing the value in our proposal and inviting us to speak that day. Please enjoy this pedagogical episode, and Rojo and I will be back in September with new episodes for the 7th season of Latinx Visions, which will center around speculative narratives. We're presenting today on comics in college, pop culture pedagogy, and Fandom Final Projects. I will have my panelists introduce themselves. I have our pictures and our affiliations up there, but we'll start down on the end. Just introduce yourself, where you're coming from, and what made you want to do comics and pop culture in your classroom. Let's see.
Thank you. I hope everybody can hear me. Thank you to Rebecca for the introduction and for really setting this panel up. I am Asif Saddiqi. I'm a professor at Fordham University in New York. And I'm really excited to be here. I do teach a course on comics, the history of comics. So I'm a historian, I should mention that. So that's how that my training, sort of shapes what I teach. How did I get into this? It's as a fan, really, sort of. I mean, I was a comic book reader as a kid, and of course, as you grow older, you start to look at comics in a very different way. You still enjoy them, but you start to maybe discern other things in them. Maybe some deeper truths or something like that. So that's really how I got to this.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for coming. My name is Jennifer Caroccio Maldonado, and I teach at Baruch College, CUNY, in English, and then also some Black and Latinx studies courses. And I got into comics, teaching specifically, because I got to read some really great graphic memoirs in undergrad, and I was just blown away with the fact that it's like, oh, we can actually read these things in college. And so I actually ended up doing my dissertation on Latinx graphic memoirs and comic biographies. And pretty much all of my courses, I try to have at least one comic or graphic narrative in some form. And I find students are really interested. Either they're coming because they're fans, or they're realizing, oh, this is something that can be for me. And so that's been really important to make sure all of my students, no matter what they look like and where they come from, know that comics can be for them.
Hello everyone, thank you for coming out today. My name is Michelle Crowley. I am a professor of communication studies at Gateway Community and Technical College, all the way from Kentucky. And I'm a little bit of the odd duck on this panel because I don't use comics specifically, but most of my classes are very heavily fandom based. And so we will bring in comics from time to time and use that in order to either give some more of like a background to the assignment or maybe give it some more cultural relevancy. But really what got me into fandom studies and such was 1994, and I turned on television and I happened to find the Power Rangers. And ever since then, I have been ears deep in all sorts of things fandom, and I've been very fortunate that I've been able to work for some wonderful places that have been able to kind of allow me to play around with my curriculum, and I'm hoping that I can impart a little bit of that knowledge today.
All right, thank you. Yes, and I'm Rebecca Salois. I'm a professor of Black and Latino Studies at Baruch College, CUNY as well. Taught in the English department before, so we kind of crossed paths there, Jennifer and I. And I really got into comics and pop culture stuff very recently. I never thought of myself as a fan of anything in particular when I was a kid. I just read, I played, whatever. It didn't cross my mind. I didn't have words for it. And I really only started reading comics after coming to Comic-Con and like little by little picked up on it. So I'm a newcomer to comics, but I really like being able to connect the pop culture and comic stuff that I do or that I enjoy with the formal work that I'm sort of expected to teach. So I'll be talking about blending those two together. So we are going to start with Asif, and go ahead. There you are.
Thanks. So recently I've been teaching a class on the history of comics, as I mentioned, and the course is on the history of comic, the genre, the idiom of comic books in the 20th century. It's largely focused on the superhero genre, but sometimes I mix it up. Recently I've been doing the superhero genre in particular. The course is very much grounded in history, and so one way in which we ground it in history is to really look at the history of the comic book industry. We start, in the 1930s and so forth, although we trace certain themes and tropes back even further into time. But we start with the 1930s with DC Comics, Batman, Superman, and that sort of thing, and then move into the Silver Age in the 60s. But all of it is grounded in American and world history, really. Everything that happens is somehow rooted in what's going on. And so it's a conversation between the history of comics and the history of this country, really. And so that's how I sort of structure the course. It's not just on discerning or looking at the text and the images and trying to find some themes, which is part of the course, but it's how to connect that to what's going on beyond it. And every time I also teach the course, I have a particular theme. Recently I've been doing something, which very loosely I call politics. But politics is a very general word. What I mean by politics is that I think about some sort of social commentary, if you will, or how do comics reflect changes in American society, very broadly, social movement, social difference, traumatic shifts in history, and so forth. And it's an interesting sort of structure for the course because you also get students who want sort of think through what does politics mean in comic books. Some people say, well, we shouldn't really talk about politics in comics. I don't like that stuff. I want to read comic books for other reasons, and that's fine. But we also sort of interrogate through what do we mean. Is the absence of politics itself a kind of position to take? And so I think those kinds of things have been very interesting for us to work through in the history in this course. So as you see, you might recognize the cover of this. This is a very historic cover from 1971, a Green Lantern, Green Arrow issue in which the authors Dennis O'Neil and Neil Adams sort of confronted issues of drug use, and which was at the forefront of a national conversation at the time. It's sort of ham-fisted, a little heavy-handed, but it's a struggle. It was a way for the superhero genre to engage in something that they thought was connected to more harder social issues. And so, this is sort of an example of what I'm doing, but one of the things I do with it, as I mentioned, students have a final project which we call History Through/From Comics. And what that means is we talk through not only how comic books have reflected historical events the last, let's say, 60, 70, 80 years, but also how comic books themselves might, in fact, be shaping our preconceptions and thoughts and prejudices in some way, because we're also consumers of comic books. I can speak for myself. I learned a lot of what the real world was about through comic books because I saw people, what they were doing, and sometimes, you sort of learn a lot of subtext from comic books without it being explicit. So I think we also work through what comic books might mean in terms of shaping people's opinions. It's not just a one-way street. So it's like a co-production, if you will. Some of the analytical themes we think of, some of the projects that I've had have been very, very interesting and smart. I've had students tracking change over time for a particular topic. How was this topic addressed in the 60s? How was it addressed in the 70s, 80s, and so forth? Which has been very interesting to see how certain topics, sort of move into the public discourse. Use of language, certain forms, certain terms, which were acceptable in the 60s and 70s are no longer acceptable. And so those kinds of things are also useful to track because language tells us something about our conceptions about racial or ethnic or economic difference, for example. I also had a paper on text versus subtext. By that I mean sometimes comic books historically have implied something. There's a subtext in it, and this is especially true of, for example, depictions of queer characters, which are subtext for a long time, which were subtext, at least in the 1980s, and then become much more explicit, become text in the 1990s. There's examples of characters like North Star in Alpha Flight and so forth, and Iceman in the X-Men. A lot of X-Men stuff is interesting here. Real-world events, World War II is an obvious one, but also more recent events like 9/11 or things like that are also very much present in the superhero genre comic books. I've had a lot of interesting research on that. There's also the issue of lag, and by that I mean I had a paper which was about do comic books lag in terms of depicting and confronting and talking about social questions? In other words, we're already talking about it socially, but our comic book creators coming to it a little bit late, maybe. Is there something there that's interesting to explore? Or in fact, do comic book creators, is that lag reducing over time? So for example, you might have something that's, sort of talking about the Vietnam War, which was, it was difficult, I think in the 1960s, a lot of creators were struggling with how to depict the war and its effects on American culture and on Vietnamese. And I think those kinds of issues, there was a lag in terms of comic books, but I think that lag has become shorter and shorter in terms of creators really trying to now, the lag between what's happening and what's shown in comic books, I think, is reducing. Some of the topics we talk about, I'll give brief examples, include dissent, protest, anti-war movements, and particularly the Vietnam War was a huge one in the 1970s. The feminist movement also comes up quite a bit, which was the women's liberation movement in the 1960s and 70s, Ms. Marple and so forth. You had, of course, the civil rights movement. And there's a subtext to that, I think, some people have argued, the X-Men could be read, for example, as a meta-commentary of the civil rights movement and race relations in general. Queer history has a very long and interesting narrative. As I mentioned, the Alpha Flight, there's many other characters that are interesting and have drawn my students' attention, including Loki, the Dora Milaje, who you see here in Black Panther, and Ayula Danica, and I can go into that later. Colonialism, of course, has been a central theme of Black Panther since the 1960s. Criminality, I put that out there. I had a student do a paper on The Dark Knight, Frank Miller's stuff, and Daredevil in the 1980s, and how, what do we think of socially and the solution to crime is? Or is crime overblown, for example? Those kinds of issues. Are vigilantism an appropriate response socially? And which ties into the issue of fascism, because some have argued whether somebody like Batman might be somewhat sort of bordering on fascism in terms of certain themes and tropes evident under Miller's writing. Poverty, inequality, I think there's also a lot of meta sort of subtext in there in terms of the characters. Peter Parker is a great example in terms of his sort of location in New York society, living in Queens. And here are just three panels from Spider-Man. One from 1966 on the left, and 1969 on the right. The bottom is 1972. It's hard to see what's going on, but I can sort of explain it. The first panel from 66 on the left, yeah, that's really, that's by Steve Ditko, and so there's a kind of, Peter Parker is confronted with a bunch of protesters, student protesters on a campus, and he really condemns them, and he's like, what are you guys doing, and this is stupid, and the protesters are presented as utterly vacuous, and they don't even have a cause, they just want to be out there, rabble rousing. The second panel in 69 is a little more generous to the protesters. We get into, I think this was Jerry Conway. It's still a little bit, Peter still doesn't engage in the protest, like he doesn't join them, but he doesn't condemn them. He sort of, there's a kind of distance, but it is a bit more generous. And then finally, the last panel in 1970, and this is all about the Vietnam War. In 1972, we have a very explicit acknowledgement of the costs. Flash Thompson, Peter Parker's friend, comes back with PTSD, and that's actually sort of worked through quite a bit in the issue. But there's also a little subplot in terms of what's happening in Vietnam and to the Vietnamese and all the different sort of gray areas of the war, so to speak. So I think that's an interesting trajectory, a shift in the discussion that's happening in a very short period of time in comic books. And so one might imagine that this is a really, I think, a great example of how comic books are shifting their discourse as things are changing. So I'm going to stop here and
So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the comics and assignments that I've used over the years in my courses. And the first one is a writing in the writing classroom, specifically a research-based course. And for this course, I used Joel Christian Gill's Strange Fruit, which focused on the lesser-known history of African Americans in the United States. And what I wanted students to see is the way that comic creators specifically can use the forum to work through research and through history, telling stories and biographies that aren't as well known, and how they deal with sources. So we looked a lot at the bibliography that Gill used and the way that he crafted the narrative. And another thing that I had them do specifically toward the end, once they were done with their research papers, is I had them do a reflection, but through the use of a multimodal assignment. And so I had them think about, what was significant in the research that they found and how they were trying to communicate it to the audience. And they were able to use any kind of visual, audio, any combination to tell that story. So I wanted them to really reflect on their journey as a researcher. And one of my students just did this just amazing comic specifically about his research process. And so here, a panel, he's sitting down, they're sitting down at a laptop, and they have these documents called the outline that they actually wrote for the research project, journal articles, so the research they used, and then the rubric and information that I gave them for the assignment. And they had then these little light bulbs for their peer ideas. They were also in research groups as well. And so he has lines from those documents going to his head. And so I thought this was just a really brilliant use of the visual form to show how the research process isn't just solitary. It's not just us coming up with these great ideas like Socrates or some shit like that. But it's a really collaborative process, and also thinking of comics as a collaborative. And then in another course, I taught Latinx literature more broadly. This was really an introduction course. And one of the texts I used was Puerto Rico Strong, that came out in the wake of Hurricane Maria. It was a collaboration of a bunch of different writers and artists from the diaspora, so both Puerto Rico was in the US and on the island. And it was just a really great collaboration showing just the wealth of Puerto Rican history and culture in comic form, artists and writers told historical narrative fictions. There were more superhero-based, more memoir-based, more historical-based comics as well. And what I really found with the students, they were really interested in the lesser-known history, particularly in one comic about the sterilization of Puerto Rican women on the island, known as the Africa. And they were rightfully outraged. And so it was a great opportunity for them to see how literature and how comics can tell those stories, can shed light on those histories, but do so in a way that isn't, just, knocking us over the head. It's very, so much explicit. And I really thought it was great for them to also kind of be confronted too with that history and, the oppression that people are still facing, but then think about then how literature can be a vehicle to both reflect that, but then talk back to it, to challenge it as well. So it's not just comics or literature more generally as this, and I think as my panelists already mentioned, doing something similar, both reflect and shape our historical understanding. And so it was really great to see students work through their understanding of that history and sit with those discomforts and really, challenge the ideas that we've all grown up with. And then this last course that I'm actually currently teaching is an American literature course. It's a survey course focusing on literature from the Civil War to the present. And I'm assigning Citizen 13660 by Ine Okubo, which is one of the first graphic memoirs in the US, which is amazing just to have this primary source, this document. And so Okubo, unfortunately, was writing about her and her family's experience during Japanese internment during World War II. She had very little possessions able to take with her when she was forcibly removed to these internment camps. And so she took daily drawings of life in these internment camps. And then it was collated, combined and published in this larger book form. And so what I want students, when reading this, is to think about particularly citizenship within, the formation of the United States as this larger cultural force, but then thinking about how citizenship is a really tenuous, fragile thing when it comes to people of color in the United States, particularly Japanese and Asian Americans in this case, and how little that can mean, how that can be taken away in the blink of an eye, and dealing with how American literature as this larger format is being created and reflects our cultural norms, but also how it reflects the white supremacy, patriarchy, hierarchy, and all the other isms in the country. And so thinking about then how the comics form as a piece of literature both reflects that, but helps us to understand our current day. So always having students bring back everything that we've read to the present day situation and understanding that this isn't anything new. This continues unfortunately to happen across the world of genocide and colonization, both within the United States, but more broadly, and the way that comics have always been there to talk back to it, to show us what's going on. And I think it's really important, particularly that my students, who are many first-generation immigrant students, need to see also themselves reflected in those comics, because I know for me, for a really long time, I didn't consider myself, a comics fan or anything like that, just because it was just predominantly white male superheroes, and I'm like, okay, that's great, but that's not, and then finally we have some kind of, opportunity to, expand our horizon, expand our world, and see that, whether it's within the fandom or the larger comics more broadly, that there's so many more stories. And so it's been really important for me as an educator to make sure my students see both that history, both where they come from and that they're unfamiliar with, but to be reflected in the things that we read, and to question those issues of occupation and colonization and genocide within the literature. We're seeing how the literature is very much grounded within our current day situation and more historically. And so it's just been a wonderful opportunity as an educator to just always find different texts to assign and different assignments, and just really be in there with students. We actually getting like one-on-one with, you actually see like kind of fans start to like, their fan-like identity start in the classroom when they're like, okay, I only read, we just read a few of the stories in Strange Fruit, for example, but then I had students tell me afterward, oh, I read the whole thing. And I was like, wait, you read more than I assigned? Beats still my heart. So it's just been a really great opportunity. So thanks so much.
Hello, everyone. So, like I said in my introduction, I come from a little bit of a different approach when it comes to popular culture. And I'm fortunate enough that I'm able to teach popular culture as a discipline. And so throughout my career, I've taught a handful of different classes within the pop culture realm, but then I also will use pop culture references in my other general education classes as well. So we'll cover both of those. And when we're looking at popular culture as a discipline, I often have students sign up for that class and they come in the first day and they're expecting to learn about Andy Warhol and some comics and maybe watch a movie or two. But really, in something that I drive home from the very first day is that pop culture matters. Pop culture is not just the fluff, it's not just the stuff that you watch or that you mindlessly scroll through. Like, it really is something that we all share with, and it's something that we all relate to, and it's one way that really it leads to a more global communication. So, starting off from saying, this stuff matters, and then taking it from kind of the general overview, then we start looking at the visual parts of popular culture. And we're focusing, or rather with a deeper focus on the cultural ideologies and the American way of thought that drives what is popular and what becomes popular. And so really breaking down those American ideologies, where they came from, why they're still around. And as the other panelists have said, all this stuff is reiterated through history. So popular culture reflects, but it also alters how we see the world around us. And the best place in order to, for all of the content creators and writers to get new material, they turn on the news. And so part of the class, we're looking at, if we take, let's say, the era right after 9/11. And so I would send the students out and say, all right, I need you to find a TV show, a movie, a comic, music that was produced from 2002 up until 2006. And given a criteria of, here is the post 9/11 world, I want you to tie these two together. And I teach mostly first year college students, and so 17, 18 years old. And for most part, they were not alive, especially as we get further on to this. I know, right? It hurts, doesn't it? I can't even make Matrix references anymore. Like, nobody gets it. So sending them out to these historical things. I'm just using the terms that they say to me, and I'm just like, I'm not even that old. And then after they bring back something that was produced during that time, and then determining, all right, so what part of the 9/11 discourse or post 9/11 discourse, what is present there? And that leads me into another class that I taught, which is on television's Supernatural. And I'm not sure if you have heard of this show. It was a quite long-running show on the CW network. It was 15 seasons, 327 episodes, and it was a very character-heavy show. And the first 5 seasons, which was the class was called The Unnatural Nature of Supernatural. And so when I first started teaching this class, I saw that I had about 15 students registered for it. I sent out an email and I said, all right, by the way, this is on the TV show, not like paranormal stuff. And then 3 people dropped. So first day, I asked my students, like, all right, what do you want to get out of this class? And it was the first time that I took a curriculum and structured it around the students. And knowing that we were going to do the first 5 seasons, which premiered in 2005 and then 2005 to 2010, we were looking at how that post 9/11, how the kind of grimness and the more of, I guess it was more of a pessimistic, more not necessarily a postmodern, but more of a meta-modern look at the world of kind of this oscillation between modernist and postmodernist mindset. And they came up with a handful of topics. Definitely they wanted to talk about the car culture was a big one. Another one was the relationships and the unhealthy sort of attachment styles that we see throughout the episodes. And what the kicker was is that this class ran during spring of 2020. And so we went on spring break and never returned. So we had a pretty good first 6 weeks of the semester, learning about all these different concepts, and then, well, now we need to pivot. And pivot we did out of a bet that I made with my students. They said, hey, you know what would be kind of funny? This is actually before lockdown. They said, you know what would be really funny is that what if we could get the stars to come in and talk to our class? Because frankly, teaching classes on shows or a particular celebrity or whatnot, that's still a pretty novel thing. So hey, why don't we throw it out there and see what happens? And I was like, yeah, sure, okay. Hey, if you can get some of the main stars to come on, you guys can all get A's and you don't have to do any more work. And they're like, well, there's actually 3 main stars. And then, what about the not brother star, Misha Collins? And I'm like, all right, if you can get him to show up, it was show up at the time, everyone gets an A on their midterm. Then lockdown happens. Yes, Misha Collins came. As well as 10 other people associated with the show, including the showrunner, Andrew Dabb. And he called in for about half an hour, and so very quickly the class shifted from a let's look at the cultural surrounding Supernatural to let's look at the culture of the fandom of Supernatural. And one of the questions that the students would ask, this is all on Zoom, every time one of the stars would call in, they're like, what do you think about the fact that we're teaching a class on Supernatural? And I had to answer to my dean for what Misha Collins said. He and I no longer get along. Yeah. He's like, well, I think your professor's lazy. He was joking. Misha Collins has a rather pointy sense of humor, and so he was joking, but that apparently made it up to the dean, and the dean is like, so what's going on with this? I'm like, you're not going to talk about the fact that I had 10 people associated with an international TV phenomenon? You're going to sit. Anyway, welcome to academia. So that was that's my major flex when it comes to fandom and classroom. And so really though, the experience that my students got out of that was really just immeasurable. I still keep in contact with about half the students today, and they still talk about the time that Mark Shepard called in, or Misha Collins, or Andrew Dabb, or Ruth Connell, Mark Pellegrino. If you know the show, we've got like a lot of the major supporting cast. So, and it was really impactful to them also because first, of course, their first year, but they're also from a rather diverse demographic, and they would not have the opportunity otherwise to come to a Comic-Con or something along those lines. So really, really brought them into the world of pop culture, and really made them reevaluate their relationship with pop culture on a whole different level.
I love that. We met through Supernatural, and so we were doing a writing group during COVID. I got to hear all about this class, so very exciting. All right, so I'm going to talk about my Latin American and Latino Studies classes that I teach at Baruch. And I teach one is, for anyone who's familiar with CUNY, it's considered a pathways course. It's basically like a gen ed option that they have. And it's got the most uninspiring title, right? Latin American Institutional and Cultural Survey. It's like, okay, what do you do with that? Well, you do what you want. No, but I do feel lucky that I teach in a place where I have the luxury to have that flexibility with the lessons and how I approach them, right? So this year, actually, this semester, I decided to revamp the course. The book I had been using before was getting a little dated, and I was having to supplement a lot more information. You know, it was published in like 2012, and as we were mentioning, some of our students were like toddlers at that point. So I decided to switch it up, and I went through and I found select readings from different sources. And there's one chapter in particular in this book by Joana Fernandez, The Young Lords, where she talks about the different offensives that the Young Lords engaged in, and in particular in this section, she is discussing the garbage offensive. So when the city wasn't picking up the garbage and the Young Lords got together and made a thing of it, like brought the attention to everyone, right? If you are familiar with the Marvel Voices series, the Comunidades number one, but there's two Comunidades number one, so, but the first one, the first of the first. There's a short comic in there, maybe 5 or 6 pages, with White Tiger. Now, White Tiger is one of Marvel's first fully fleshed out Latino characters. He gets a backstory. We learn about him. He's not just some stereotype. We have a little bit of a discussion about the idea that he's White Tiger as a Black man, an Afro-Puerto Rican man. But in this comic, he's kind of going through like the city and seeing all of this and like, what does he do? And it's a Marvel comic, so we get like a trash monster that's like the bad guy that comes out of it. But introducing them to this through the comic first and being like, hey, check this out. What do you think? Let's talk about how real this is. Let's talk about the actual history and the impact and the people who were challenging what was happening in the city at this time, right? So in this case, it sort of serves as like a gateway to what might be considered a more serious and intense topic. Now, the second one that I have up here is about the effect of U.S. interventions in Latin America on migration. And this one I do in reverse, right? This one we talk about the interventions of the U.S. specifically in Central America, but throughout Latin America, focusing on how often, under what conditions, and what was the rationale behind these U.S. interventions, right? And when we talk about the euphemistic term of intervention as well, because many of them were just invasions. And then I have them look at this comic by Pablo Leon. It's called Journey. You can find it on the Rewire Newsgroup page. The whole thing is free and accessible, which is how I gave it to my students in this case. I don't know if he's here this year, but if he is, he did sell paper copies of it last year. So it might be worth checking out if he's down in Artist Alley. So we looked at this sort of history of intervention and what the impact was in these countries. And then we looked at this migration story of a young woman who migrated from Guatemala and her journey through Mexico and then across the US border and everything that she went through. And then we looked at how those events that happened in the late 19th century, in the first half of the 20th century, and that continued throughout the latter half of the 20th century, had a direct impact on the migration that we see into the US today, right? It's not, they're just coming because they feel like it. There are socioeconomic reasons, there are political reasons, and so on. Let's look at where that stems from, and then let's look at what the result of it is. So these are just two pieces I do in my intro course. I do one other on identity, which is really great because as a required course, I don't only have Latino students in my class. I have a lot of East Asian, South Asian students as well. And they can connect with that identity piece of that feeling in between. So that's a third piece I use. I think that one comes from Tales from La Vida, which is another great book, but I just do the one chapter from it. And then right now I'm also going to talk about the Latinx literature in the US course. It's a cross-listed course between English, comparative literature, and Latino studies, so we take turns teaching it. And I decided this semester that I was going to do it entirely through graphic narratives. And I broke it down into, 4 main sections. I thought, let's start with superheroes, because that's a good gateway into reading comics. I had to do a lot of teaching my students how to read comics, right? About half of my students are English majors. They're used to sitting there and reading big chapter prose books, like on, and they're like, well, how do I annotate this? How do I make notes for this? What do all these things mean? So we broke down the pieces of the comics, talked about the different kind of text boxes, talked about the panel shape, size, formation, thank you, the gunners, all of that as kind of a gateway into how to read comics. Now, we looked particularly at America Chavez, Volume 1, and Reptile, which I am partial to because I feel like Reptile doesn't get enough love. I mean, he's part dinosaur. That's pretty awesome. And right now, they just finished up Frontera, which just came out, and I will give a plug for him because I love all of his work, but Julio Anta is here and Jacoby Salcedo. They're definitely an artist alley this weekend. And that's a border crossing story that's combined with the supernatural. So there's a ghost story and a border crossing story, and it's not the typical border crossing story that you would expect, right? They take a twist on it. I love the way they incorporate actual events from the border into it, right? Like there's this jaguar, El Jefe, and he's real, right? He was a real jaguar on the Arizona-Mexico border. We're going to later in the semester look at memoir and cultural nonfiction, just sort of building off of that. I complement a lot of these comic readings with journal articles, with some of those quote-unquote serious academic readings, which again, as we've all mentioned, comics very much can be that as well. But the things that they're sort of expected to read. But I also combine it with some podcast episodes. And I'm the co-host of this podcast, Latinx Visions, with my colleague, Rojo Robles. And we have one episode in particular that is focused on Miles Morales' Spider-Man. And we looked at him in terms of the comics, in terms of the films, in terms of the video games, and looked at all of these different mediums in which he's portrayed and how he's portrayed. So that's really great. For the students themselves, they're doing a portfolio for the semester, and they have to include a glossary with terms that are comic book terms or graphic narrative terms, Latinx terms, literary theory terms. All of these are expected to be there. They're doing blog posts, and if you use the QR code, you can see some of them that they've posted. Since they don't have hard deadlines, a lot of them are waiting. But it will be building throughout the semester. You should be able to go in. I know there's a handful on America Chavez already. They're going to do an annotated bibliography project. And then for their final reflection, actually, it kind of reminds me of what you were talking about, Jennifer, is they're going to create they can write it if they really want to, but I've given them the option to do a visual, do their own comic book panel saying what was my experience in this class? How did I come into the class? What did I learn throughout? What am I gonna take with me after the class? So giving them those different mediums to play with, even within graphic narratives is helpful to me. All right, so I think that is the presentation part of it, but we definitely have time for questions, yes? Okay.
Is it possible that we can get a copy of the presentation slides from today?
So I think we're recording the audio, yes, for the main panel segment, and what I can do is put these on a Google Slides platform and put a link in that episode. I think that's probably the easiest way for me to share it. So there'll be a link to it. That's all right with the panelists?
Also, I'm sure if you contact any of us on email, you have our names, and if you email us, I'm sure we'll be happy to share our materials.
Mm-hmm.
I know I will.
Absolutely.
How do you introduce comics for non-comic readers in your class?
Yeah, so what I'll do is I'll do a short lecture with visuals and just actually lay out this is what a comic page looks like. So point out what the frame is, the gutter, narration, speech bubbles, all that terminology. I'll give them examples. And another thing I do is talk about the image-text relationship. And so the three that I've identified that I like them to look at is how the text image complement each other. So how, when you put them together, they are synthesized to make a whole new message that you wouldn't understand otherwise. One is how they contradict each other. So often that's a lot of times when we'll see humor being used when the narration says one thing, but it's clearly being depicted in the visuals something completely different. And so how irony and humor are used. And then the other is supplemental, just kind of how it's adding onto it or reiterating it. And so that's how I started out, is just kind of making sure they understand what the visuals, what they're looking at on the page, and then really focusing on the text image relationship.
I will say that on the QR code that I gave you, there is one page on that site that has the slides I've used. Now the slides I use are more question, discussion, provoking type slides than really detailed, but you can kind of get a rough idea of the things I've used.
So if you contact me, I'm happy to share my PowerPoints on how to read comics.
How do you as professors combat the perspective often upheld in academia that pop culture and comics don't always hold the most academic or serious connotations, particularly in terms of getting courses approved by curriculum, getting tenure, etc.? What advice do you have for junior faculty who want to do this type of research but are concerned about how it will affect their career?
I would say I'm very lucky to be in a department where that sort of thing is supported. But one of the things that you noticed that I think Jennifer and I both mentioned was we taught these comics through a course that was already established, right? Latinx literature in the US is a course that is on the books, and so everyone can teach it according to their own knowledge and experience. And so that's one of the ways I've done, is kind of taken existing curriculum and dropped it in and shifted it.
I am a K-12 educator, and this is the level I want my students to get to. Do you have any advice or suggested reading material for my students? Are there ways to bridge the gap between what you teach and what I teach that might be seen as fun for students?
What I've done in the past is that I've had students bring me examples of stuff that they've read or that they're interested in, and then I'll read through it and then kind of do a little bit of Google searching and see, all right, what else is similar to this? What else is in kind of the same vein? And so at least, depending on hopefully where they are, reading level and grade and whatnot, get some more interest that way. So definitely using the students as a resource, and really also just trusting them too.
Yeah, I think the students pick up a lot more. There are a handful of students in my class, for example, who do have a lot of experience reading comics, and they're just yeah, I've been picking up on this since forever. So like, I think it does go into that idea of trust in them. Like, they will grasp that. There's something about the visual and words together that makes it easier to grasp concepts that they might not yet have the spoken vocabulary for, but that you can build off of. I mean, it has been 15 years since I taught high school and I didn't do comics then. So I don't know if I have any specific examples, but
working with your librarian would be like, just if you give it to them, if you make it available. Like, for example, my 2-year-old, I brought a bunch of comics during Free Comic Book Day, and I just have them around, and he's already he's not reading, but he's looking through them. And so I just think if you just make comics and graphic novels age appropriate, obviously we're talking mostly about kind of older adult comics, but there's such a wide range of YA and children's comics. That's the other thing I think we forget sometimes in the quest to make it rigorous academic field. Also comics are for kids. And so I think making it available for them to read, and then also connecting it to, there's so many shows that we all grew up watching that we don't realize were originally comics. And so maybe finding those shows or anime that they watch, and then bringing in the adaptations of actually this was originally a book. And so that's another way I think might be great to bridge that gap. But also thank you so much for doing that work.
Thank you to all the panelists, and thank you everyone for joining us for this session.